The summer I turned 9, my father taught me how to change a tire on the side of Route 7 in Vermont. It was July, hot enough that the asphalt shimmered, and he made it feel like the most important skill in the world. He said, "Nadia, you remember this. You never want to be the kind of woman who needs to wait for someone else to fix things." I thought about that moment a lot in the years that followed. I thought about it especially on the night my stepfather's hands closed around my throat, in my own kitchen, in my own house, in the town where I'd built everything I had from scratch. And I realized with absolute clarity that my father had been preparing me for exactly this. I need to back up. My parents had one of those marriages that people describe as solid. Not showy, not the kind that made for good dinner party stories. Just solid. My father was a civil engineer who spent his career building bridges in northern New England. My mother taught 3rd grade for 22 years at the same elementary school, where she herself had been a student. We lived in a house with green shutters outside Burlington, Vermont, and our biggest family drama was whether to get a second dog. His name was going to be Biscuit. We never got him. My father died of a heart attack 11 days before my 16th birthday. He was 51 years old. He was healthy. He ran 5 miles every Saturday morning. He had no history of heart disease. The cardiologist told us it was a spontaneous coronary artery dissection, a tear in the wall of the artery, rare, devastating, almost impossible to predict. There was nothing anyone could have done. That was supposed to make it easier. It didn't. What happened to my mother after that? I understand it better now than I did at 17, 18, 19. Grief does strange things to people. It shrinks the world until all you can see is the space where the person used to be, and sometimes you'll do anything to fill it. She started going to a grief support group at the community center on Williston Road. That was where she met him. My stepfather's name is Russell Crane. He was 53 when they met, recently divorced, with a grown son in Arizona who he barely spoke to. He had a landscaping business, a leased F-250, and a way of talking about himself that made everything sound like a recovered hardship. The divorce was hard. The business was a struggle. Life had been tough, but he'd come through it. My mother found that compelling. She was in her own hard chapter, and here was someone who seemed to understand what it meant to survive one. They dated for 8 months. I was away at the University of New Hampshire by then, studying accounting, working 20 hours a week at a campus library to cover what my partial scholarship didn't. I met Russell twice before my mother called to tell me they were engaged. The first time was Thanksgiving. He brought a pie from a bakery and talked a lot about himself. The second time was Christmas. He talked a lot about himself again. I didn't say anything when she told me. I asked if she was happy. She said yes, she thought so. I said okay. I meant it, genuinely, at the time. The wedding was small. Her sister came up from Connecticut, a few close friends, a colleague from the school. I was the maid of honor in a blue dress I'd bought on sale. I smiled in every photograph. I meant that too. I was 21 years old, and I wanted my mother to be okay. That was the only thing I wanted. The night after the wedding was when I first understood that something was wrong. I'd stayed over, sleeping in my old bedroom. Russell had a few too many drinks at the small reception dinner, and on the drive back to the house, he made a comment. I won't repeat it exactly, but it was about how things were going to be different now, and how my mother needed someone who could actually take care of her, which implied, clearly, that the people who had been taking care of her before weren't doing it right. I looked at my mother in the passenger seat. She was looking out the window. In the morning, I found her in the kitchen, and I asked if everything was okay. She smiled at me and said Russell was just tired. He got like that sometimes when he was tired. It wasn't a big deal. I drove back to Durham that afternoon with a low, specific feeling in my stomach that I couldn't name. Over the following year, the calls became shorter. My mother, who had once talked to me every Sunday for an hour or more, Started keeping conversations to 15 minutes. 20 if I pushed. She always seemed a little distracted, a little careful with her words, like she was editing herself in real time. When I asked about school, she was still teaching, she'd say it was fine. When I asked about Russell, she'd say it was fine. When I asked how she was, she'd say she was fine and then change the subject. I graduated in May, 2 days before my 23rd birthday. She came alone. Russell had a job he couldn't reschedule. I posed for photos on the quad in my cap and gown, and she kept touching my arm like she was reassuring herself I was really there. I moved to Portland, Maine that August. I'd taken a position at a regional accounting firm. Not glamorous, not a big salary, but real work, benefits, a path. I found an apartment on Munjoy Hill with original hardwood floors and a window in the kitchen that looked out over the harbor. I loved it. I was making my life. I went back to Burlington for Thanksgiving that year, my first time visiting since the wedding. The green shutters were gone. Russell had painted the house gray. He said green was dated. My mother said she thought it looked nice. At dinner, Russell talked about expanding the landscaping business, about buying out a competitor, about how the margins in his industry were actually quite good if you ran things right. My mother passed dishes and agreed with things. I asked her about a student she'd mentioned on the phone, a boy who'd been having a hard time, and she started to answer, and Russell talked over her about something else entirely, and she just let it go. After dinner, when Russell was watching television, I found my mother in the kitchen and I asked her directly, was she happy? She dried her hands on a dish towel and looked at me and said, I'm adjusting. I said that's not the same thing. She said she knew that. She did not say anything else. I started coming back more often, every 6 or 8 weeks instead of the major holidays. I told myself it was because I missed her. That was true. But I was also watching. I was keeping a record in my head of things I noticed. The way she flinched slightly when he raised his voice to make a joke. The way she checked his expression before she answered questions I asked her. The way she'd stop talking about her colleagues, her students, her sister, the small daily textures of her life that used to fill our conversations. Those things had all been replaced by his schedule, his opinions, his plans. In March, about 18 months after the wedding, my mother called me on a Tuesday night. She usually didn't call on weeknights. Her voice was very even, and she told me that she'd had a small accident. She'd slipped on the back steps, which were icy, and bruised her ribs. She was fine. She just wanted me to know. I asked if she'd gone to the doctor. She said Russell had looked at them and said they were probably just bruised, not broken, and that it wasn't worth the copay. I asked if she wanted me to come up. She said no, don't do that. It was a long drive for nothing. I lay on my kitchen floor for a while after I hung up. I don't know how long. I looked at the ceiling and I thought about my father changing a tire on Route 7. I thought about the way he made things feel manageable. I thought about how none of this would be happening if he hadn't died, and I pushed that thought away because it wasn't useful. I called my aunt in Connecticut. She'd noticed things too. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of the call, we agreed to pay close attention and stay in contact. We didn't know what else to do. My mother was an adult. She hadn't asked for help. She kept saying she was fine. The following July, I drove up to Burlington on a Saturday without calling first. I'd told myself I was just passing through, which was not even remotely true. Burlington is not on the way to anything from Portland, Maine. I just needed to see her. Russell's truck was gone. I knocked, and my mother answered the door in a way that told me she was relieved to see me before she was surprised. She made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a while, she talked about school getting out, about her garden, about normal things. And then she stopped. She set down her mug. She looked out the window. She said, "He took my name off the checking account." I kept my voice very steady. I asked when. She said 3 months ago. He'd said it was easier for him to manage the household expenses since she was at work all day. She still had her teacher's direct deposit going into her own savings account. But the shared account, the one they'd opened together when they got married, the one the mortgage came out of, her name wasn't on it anymore. I asked if she'd said anything to him. She said she had. He'd said she was being ungrateful, that he was trying to handle things so she didn't have to worry. He'd said it in a way that made her feel like the problem was her understanding of what he was doing, not the thing itself. I recognized that. I had a name for it by then. I'd been reading. I'd been doing research quietly on my own at night, after work. I knew what it was called when someone systematically removes your access to money, your autonomy, your outside relationships, your sense of your own reality. I knew what it was. I just couldn't make my mother see it yet. I stayed for dinner. Russell came home at 6. He walked in and saw me at the table, and the first thing he said was, not a question, a statement, flat with an edge underneath it. I told him I was visiting my mother. He said, sure, and went to wash his hands. And when he came back to the table, he was all smiles and easy conversation, and he talked to me about my job and asked if I was seeing anyone, and wasn't it great that I could make the drive up. He was charming in the performative way that certain men are charming when they're being watched. I watched my mother's posture change while he talked. She got smaller. I drove back to Portland that night, instead of staying over like I'd planned. I called a domestic violence hotline the next morning. Not for me. I called to ask what I could do for someone else. The person I spoke to was kind and thorough. She told me that I couldn't make my mother leave before she was ready. She told me to keep contact, stay present, document what I observed, and make sure my mother knew she had somewhere to go. She told me that leaving was statistically the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship, and that my job right now was to make sure the door stayed open, not to push my mother through it. I made sure my mother had cash. Every time I visited, I'd leave an envelope in the pocket of her winter coat, $300, whatever I could manage. I didn't tell her what it was for. She never mentioned it. I think she knew. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in November. I know it was a Thursday because I was on a work deadline. The firm's biggest client had a filing due Friday morning, and I'd been in the office until almost 9. I got home, changed into sweats, made toast for dinner because I was too tired to cook anything real. My phone rang at 11:14 p.m. It was my mother. She wasn't speaking. I could hear her breathing, fast, shallow, the specific texture of someone trying not to make noise, and underneath it, I could hear him. Not words, just his voice, raised, then a crash. Something heavy hitting a wall or a counter. I said her name. She didn't answer, but she didn't hang up either. I called 911 on my landline. Yes, I still had a landline. My father had always said you needed one, while keeping my cell pressed to my ear. I gave the Burlington address. I told them what I could hear. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line, and I did. I heard the operator's voice through my cell telling me units were on the way, and I just kept saying, "Mom, I'm here. Help is coming. I'm here." The line went quiet. Then I heard her say in a very small voice that it was okay, that she dropped something, that it was nothing. I said, "The police are already on their way." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she started to cry. The officers arrived in under 7 minutes. Russell told them my mother had fallen. My mother had a bruise forming under her left eye and a split lip. She told them she'd fallen. One of the responding officers, a woman, asked to speak with my mother privately while her partner kept Russell in the living room. My mother, alone with the female officer in the bedroom, told her the truth. She told her about that night, and she told her about the ribs in March, and she told her about something that had happened with his fist and the bathroom door frame that she had never told anyone, including me. Russell was arrested that night. He spent 2 nights in the Chittenden County Jail before his lawyer got him out on bail. A no-contact order was issued immediately. I was in Burlington by 6 the next morning. I'd packed a bag the night before, had it by the door, was on the road by 3 a.m. When I got to the house, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she looked exhausted in a way that was different from the exhaustion of the past 3 years. It was the exhaustion of someone who has finally been able to stop holding something up. I sat down across from her, and she looked at me for a long time, and then she said, "I should have listened to you." I said, "You're listening now." The next weeks were complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother had loved Russell, or had loved the version of him she'd believed she was marrying. Untangling that, the grief of losing someone you loved who turned out to be dangerous, while also carrying the grief of the original loss that had made you vulnerable in the first place, is not a simple or linear process. Some days she was clear. Some days she wavered. He called from a friend's cell phone once, violating the no-contact order, and she didn't answer, but she cried for 2 hours afterward. I sat with her. I didn't say anything judgmental. I'd been told, by the counselor she'd started seeing, by the advocate from the organization that helped us navigate the legal process, that judgment was the enemy of progress. The divorce took 7 months. Russell's attorney tried to argue for a portion of my parents' house, which Russell's name was also on from the marriage. That was a fight. My mother had a good attorney, found through the local legal aid office, and the financial exploitation, the checking account, the documented pattern of control, was part of the record. He did not get the house. He got nothing from it. He was also formally charged with domestic assault. He eventually pleaded to a lesser charge and received 2 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent protection order. I know some people think that wasn't enough. I understand that feeling. Some days I share it. But here is what I also know. My mother got her name back. She changed the locks. She repainted the house. Not green again. She chose a soft yellow she'd always liked, the color of the kitchen in the house where she grew up. She went back to teaching the following September, and one of her students made her a card on the first day of school that said, "We missed you, Miss C." And she kept it on her desk all year. She called me once on Sunday, a few months after the divorce was finalized. We talked for almost 2 hours the way we used to. She told me about a student who'd figured out fractions on her own using pizza slices as a reference, and how the girl's face had changed when it clicked, that specific face children make when the world suddenly makes sense. My mother sounded like herself. She sounded like the woman who used to call me every Sunday and fill an hour without effort. The woman who had been there all along, underneath everything. I thought about my father. I thought about the side of Route 7 in July, the hot asphalt, his hands on the tire iron, teaching me to take care of things. He would have hated every moment of what our family went through after he was gone. But I think he also would have recognized something in how it ended. Not neatly, not without damage, but with my mother still in her house, in her classroom, on the phone with me on Sunday mornings, making sense of the world one small thing at a time. Sometimes the door that saves you is the one you never expected to have to use. And sometimes the person who needs rescuing has been there, waiting longer than you knew.